Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Khalil Jahshan. I'm Executive Director of the Arab Center, Washington. I'd like to welcome all of you to this briefing focusing on Jerusalem, or more precisely on the recent shift in policy by the U.S. With regards to Jerusalem, and is it a fatal blow to Trump's so-called ultimate deal? We have with us three panelists that are more than equipped to deal with this question in various aspects of it. We will begin with our colleague, Dr. Yousef Munayyer, who is Executive Director of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights here in the United States, and is a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. After Yousef's presentation, Zaha Hassan, who's a Middle East fellow at New America and former senior legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team during the old days of negotiations when we had a peace process. And last but not least, our good friend Perry Cammack, who is Middle East fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and former member of Secretary John Kerry's policy planning staff at the State Department, and spent quite a few years with him in the Senate also. Let me just say a few words with regards to the issue before us, and then I'll turn over the microphone to Yousef. Basically, as you all know, almost a week ago, Wednesday, December 6, to be precise, President Trump addressed the nation from the White House, from the diplomatic reception room, about U.S. policy regarding Jerusalem. And in spite of the fact that they kind of hyped the issue for several days before that, it was still somewhat of a surprising announcement with regard to policy that has been intact for so long under different administrations, at least 4 administrations before him. The president claiming that, and I'm quoting him, "We cannot solve our problem by making the same failed assumptions and repeating the same failed strategies of the past," and accusing his predecessors of lack of courage and failure to deliver on their campaign promises, went ahead to declare that, again, I quote him, "I have determined that it is time to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel," end of quote. Then he moved swiftly to direct the U.S. Department of State, apparently unaware of the logistical difficulties we faced as a country before that on at least 2 or 3 previous attempts to relocate the embassy in terms of the actual real estate issue and other complexities, the ownership of the actual real estate that we looked at in the past, ordered the State Department to go ahead and take the initial steps to move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Of course, the president, as we all remember, justified his ill-advised and somewhat, like I said, surprising decision on the basis of several assumptions, characterized by the same, if not even a worse degree of falsehood or lack of logic and failure than those that he leveled at his predecessors, claiming that his declaration fulfilled at least 4 or 5 items from his perspective as President of the United States. One, he said it's in the interest, his step is in the interest of the United States of America. 2, he said it is made in the pursuit of peace between Israel and the Palestinians. 3, that he is finally acknowledging the obvious, that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. It's very obvious, and it's time to kind of recognize that. And he claimed in his statement that his statement is nothing more or less than that, a recognition of reality. And in typical Trumpian logic, he insisted that his significant change in policy on Jerusalem does not constitute, quote, taking a position on any final status issues, including the specific boundaries of Israeli sovereignty in the city or the resolution of contested borders pertaining to Jerusalem. And then he assured not just the American people, but assured the world community that his step, or in my lexicon, rather misstep, is not intended in any way to reflect a departure from our strong commitment to facilitate a lasting peace agreement. And that is a great deal, as he described it, for both the Israelis and also a great deal for the Palestinians. Now, over the past 5 days since that statement, almost the opposite has happened with regards to all these goals that the president has specified. Clearly, I think events in the region are telling us today that this statement has been actually working contrary to American interests in the region. It has alienated our allies in the region, except one. To hear statements, as some of you probably have read, as I have, statements from Saudi leaders, from UAE leaders, from almost every country in the region, in addition to traditional allies of the United States, from Germany to the UK, EU, France, even the Vatican, for God's sake. The Pope had to pray about this a couple of days ago, had to do a special prayer, actually, for the region in response to this statement. You know, on December 5th, I was one of those 61% of Americans that classified the president as unfit to deal with foreign policy and national security. I have changed my mind since this. I have never seen a speech that managed to basically unite all the Arabs, unite all the Muslims, excite all the terrorists, and in one slurred speech. That's all it took. To me, that's genius in leadership. Okay? So to help us understand this genius and the implication of that, we will go ahead now and turn the microphone to my friend and colleague, Dr. Yousef Munayyer. Please, Yousef.
Thank you, Khalil. Let me begin by apologizing for my raspy voice this morning, and thank you all for joining and for our colleagues on the panel. 100 years after the Balfour Declaration, the Trump Declaration, in my view, on recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, will very much mark a departure from one era and the beginning of a new era. The era that I believe now has finally closed is the era of Oslo. And I believe that this declaration now is a very clear indication of that coming to a close. What comes next, I think, is much harder for us to really decipher. I want to talk a little bit about a few different things. Why this was a reversal in longstanding U.S. policy and why that matters. What exactly is the new U.S. position on Jerusalem? We're still trying to figure that out. What message will both Israelis and Palestinians take from the decision by the president on Jerusalem? And what comes next for Israel-Palestine, how this impacts the region, and what it means for U.S. engagement, both in this conflict and in conflict resolution around the world. So U.S. policy in Jerusalem since 1947 goes back to the U.S. position on the UN partition plan, where the United Nations decided to partition Palestine into two states, an Arab state and a Jewish state, against the will of the native population. But they treated Jerusalem as a separate entity entirely. It was a corpus separatum that was not to fall under the sovereignty of either state. Of course, after 1947 and the start of the war in 1948, the UN partition plan and the outlines of it essentially were sent out the window because of the war, and Israel ended up not with 55% of the territory as allotted to it under the partition plan, but 78% of the territory leaving the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And in the course of this, it came to control West Jerusalem, what was West Jerusalem at the time. After 1967 and the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and other Arab territories, the Israelis unilaterally expanded the municipality of Jerusalem. East Jerusalem went from being 6.5 square kilometers to 72 square kilometers. And in doing so, enveloping within this new municipal boundary of occupied East Jerusalem, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who are now residents of the municipality of Jerusalem, but not citizens of the State of Israel and not living in the same status of Palestinians in the West Bank. U.S. policy has consistently been that they will not recognize Jerusalem as belonging to either one of the parties precisely because the status of it as determined by the international community was not given to any particular party in 1947. And since then, it has been in dispute, and only through a final negotiation and agreement between the parties could there then be a decision and recognition by the international community on where Jerusalem falls, who has sovereignty over what parts of it, and so on. And I think it's important also to note that the U.S. position on Jerusalem was really instrumental in the beginning of the peace process as we know it. For those of you who will remember the 1991 Madrid conference and the process that led to that, the Israelis refused to enter into any process in which there would be Palestinian representatives from Jerusalem. And the Palestinians insisted that if that was going to be the case, then there needed to be guarantees from the United States about the American position on Jerusalem, and the fact that they're not sending a representative from Jerusalem would not result in any sorts of impressions about concessions on claims to Jerusalem. And in fact, the United States gave those guarantees, and it was on the basis of those guarantees that a Palestinian delegation was willing and able to participate in the Madrid conference. So those guarantees now go out the window, shaking the very foundation of what was the peace process. What is the new U.S. position? It's very difficult to decipher this. If you listen to what the president said and you listen to what has been said since then by American officials, and I want to read here because it's important to get this right. The president said he recognizes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and the eternal capital of the Jewish people. Nikki Haley on Sunday, who is the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, had this to say. The Americans just said, we want our embassy in the capital, and that capital is Jerusalem. And by making this declaration, President Trump took Jerusalem off the table. He took it off the table. So now they get to come together, they get to decide what the borders will look like, they get to decide the boundaries, and they get to talk about how they want to see Jerusalem going forward. So the American position seems to be that Jerusalem is not up for negotiation, but it is, and at the same time, the Americans have already awarded it to Israel. You can see why that is confusing and problematic if you're trying to maintain some sort of credibility with the parties. But I don't want to create the impression that this means that nothing has changed. I think that even though the Americans are trying to present some nuance in their position, the implications of this are actually very serious and most directly serious for Palestinians living in Jerusalem itself. And I would recall in 2000, when we saw the Clinton parameters, one of the principles that underpinned the American position and the parameters towards Jerusalem and a division of Jerusalem in the final agreement was the notion that those areas which are Jewish will remain Jewish, and those areas which are Arab will become Palestinian in a division of Jerusalem. Now, this never became American policy because, of course, the parameters were a proposal, and this would only carry weight if this was part of a package deal that would resolve all final status issues. But nonetheless, that message sent a very important signal to the Israelis. If you create realities on the ground, America will have to recognize them. And I think this declaration by Donald Trump on Jerusalem sends and reinforces that very same message. The armistice line, the line that demarcates occupied territory under international law, is no longer relevant in American policy now formally. And the message that the Israelis get is that the American president, the leader of the strongest nation on earth, recognizes and validates their narrative on Jerusalem. And I think that's very important, particularly for Palestinians in the city, because they have been under constant pressure because of various Israeli policies aimed at re-engineering the demographics of the city to force Palestinians out and to create a reality in and around the city where the vast majority of the inhabitants are Jewish, increase the size of the settlements in East Jerusalem, and ensure that there will never be a way to divide Jerusalem or permit the remainder of the West Bank to have any sort of sovereign and contiguous access to the capital or its environs. So I think what this will do is embolden those voices in Israel, particularly on the Israeli right, who say, you see, we were right. We don't have to concede anything, and as long as we create realities on the ground, the Americans will have to recognize them. The path forward for us is to continue to do that, and ultimately the Americans are just going to have to recognize the reality as it is, which is the way that the president had put it. Of course, the Israelis are the only party that can create realities on the ground because of this imbalance of power between the parties. And the absence of any American or international restraint on them means that you will probably continue to see what we have seen for the past 50 years, which is this ongoing settlement building throughout occupied territory. For Palestinians, what they will hear, of course, is something very similar, that the President of the United States has validated an Israeli narrative. And I think Palestinians had already been very skeptical of the ability of the United States to in any way even-handedly mediate. But there were a couple issues on which American policy had remained somewhat consistent, if not emphatic. That was on the issue of Jerusalem and the fact that they would not recognize it until a final status issue, on the issue of Israeli settlements and the problem that they present, and on the idea of a two-state outcome to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. All of those things have gone out the window in the first year of the Trump administration. All of them. They are not condemning Israeli settlement expansion, which is taking place at a significant pace in the way that previous administrations have on both sides of the aisle. They've changed their position on Jerusalem, which has sent shockwaves throughout the region. And they refuse to say that a two-state solution is the stated goal of U.S. policy in mediating this issue. That is very significant. President Trump said, and his UN ambassador also repeated this, it's up to the parties to decide. The problem, again, of course, is that if the Israelis don't want a state, a Palestinian state, and they don't, the Americans have effectively given the stronger party a veto over Palestinian rights and Palestinian self-determination. So what Palestinians are hearing now, including those who could cling to these few issues where U.S. policy remained somewhat consistent over the years, is that there's absolutely no way for the United States to continue to play a role in this process. And no self-respecting Palestinian leader, no self-respecting Palestinian leader could possibly go back to the United States and expect that the strategy of negotiating through Washington will yield an independent Palestinian state. And I would recall, too, that in May, Mahmoud Abbas, who's the chairman of the PLO, was here in the United States, met with President Trump for the first time, He spoke primarily in Arabic, but he left the last sentence in his comments in English, presumably to ensure that the president would hear it directly from him. And those words were, "Now, Mr. President, with you, we have hope." Now, Mr. President, with you, we have hope. Mahmoud Abbas, prior to this declaration, was facing about 67% of the Palestinian population that wanted to see him step down and resign. Most Palestinians do not believe that there's going to be a Palestinian state anytime soon, if not ever. So the political program that the Palestinian leadership, led by Mahmoud Abbas, has been putting forward as a strategy for liberation has been eviscerated, both by the so-called mediator in this process, and it's very clear among the Palestinian public that they have lost faith in that approach, and for that reason, Washington cannot expect any Palestinian leader, after throwing Abbas under the bus so many times, to be able to come back and be credible before his own people. So in closing, what is next for Israel, Palestine, the Middle East, and U.S. engagement? You know, we saw condemnation of this declaration from around the world. The Arab League, Khalil, as you said, which doesn't agree on much these days, and the Organization of the Islamic Conference, which includes 57 Arab and Muslim states, and which, by the way, was put together as an international organization because of the issue of Jerusalem. It was because of an attack on a holy site in Jerusalem that the Organization of the Islamic Conference came together. All of them obviously condemned the declaration by President Trump, but condemnation was not limited to the Arab and Muslim world. We saw it around the world, including from American allies, some of America's strongest allies. And at the United Nations on Friday, at the United Nations Security Council, one member after the other denounced what the American president did. And the response from Nikki Haley, the American ambassador, was, "No one in this room gets to judge us," which is often the line that you may expect to hear from the Russian ambassador at the United Nations Security Council, not from the American ambassador. But that is the line that she chose to state there. And so I think possible openings that occur because of this is that certain states, particularly in Europe, who have been frustrated with America's role over the last several years because they feel that they've been asked to finance a peace process that the Americans are not effectively mediating, may exercise some more independence in their relations with Israel, and there may be opportunities for the Palestinians to engage with the Europeans to take steps to put more pressure on Israel because of that. And I think we expect in the coming months the United Nations Human Rights Council to issue a report that documents Israeli corporations and international corporations that are profiting off of the occupation. There will most certainly be a diplomatic flurry both by Israel and the United States in an effort to try to suppress that. And as Israel and the United States will go to the European allies and say, "We really don't think this advances the prospects of peace," the Europeans will have to look back at them and say, "Well, we don't think this Jerusalem declaration that you did does either." And so while it's unclear where we go from here, I think it's very clear that U.S. engagement has suffered significantly, U.S. credibility has suffered significantly, and for Palestinians in particular, it's become clear even to those who had faith in the United States, the few that did, that that is no longer the case. Thank you.
Thank you, Yousef. And now we turn the microphone to Zaha Hassan.
Thank you. First, I want to say thank you to the Arab Center for inviting me, and to Khalil and Tamara and the others who organized the conference today. I appreciate that. And thank you to Yousef and Perry for joining me on this panel. I thought what I'd do today is go over first what Trump did and didn't do. And I'm going to agree very strongly with Yousef on the analysis of what I think happened and what didn't. I'm going to look at why now. Why did Trump choose now to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel? And I want to talk a little bit about what legal effect this recognition has, and finally, what actions might Palestinians and those interested in supporting international legality take following this recognition. So, what happened and what didn't? As Yousef said, the U.S. said it was just acknowledging reality and furthering peace in its recognition. It directed the move of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. Trump said the status quo with respect to the holy sites would be maintained, and he would support a two-state solution if the parties agree. So what did the U.S. not do? It specifically said it wasn't going to recognize the borders of Jerusalem, and it did not indicate where the embassy would be located or how long it would take before the physical embassy would be available for moving in. The bottom line, if we translate what Trump said, is basically the U.S. does not support a two-state solution because Israel does not agree to such a solution. Therefore, Palestinians who have no state can have no claim over an East Jerusalem for their capital. And effectively, if the U.S. is to be the broker of a two-state solution between Israelis and Palestinians, this is the end of the two-state solution. So trying to explain what Trump did in the State Department and with other officials, we hear from Tillerson that, not to worry, this has no real practical effect. We heard from the Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs, David Satterfield, that there would be no change in consular practice. In passports, Jerusalem would, if an American citizen was born in Jerusalem, it would just say Jerusalem without indicating the country of birth. And he said that, quote, "We are not taking a position on the boundaries of sovereignty in Jerusalem, including the geographic boundaries, and I will not elaborate on that further." End of quote. There was also a backgrounder press conference to explain Trump's recognition, and basically they said, we will not indicate what is East Jerusalem and what is West Jerusalem or prejudge negotiations on the boundaries. So what are the practical implications? So we know passports aren't going to change. What about the U.S. position on labeling of products coming out of East Jerusalem? There's a number of complaints sitting with Customs and Border Control about products coming from East Jerusalem that are labeled Made in Israel. Is the U.S. now going to adjudicate those complaints and find that those are properly labeled Made in Israel, or are they going to keep those cases unresolved? My guess is they'll keep them unresolved. What about the chaos that's going to unfold when you have the U.S. in international organizations and mechanisms in which the entire world talks about Jerusalem as being occupied territory and the U.S. taking a different position? Is it going to maintain that position in organizations like the World Trade Organization or the Universal Postal Union or the World Tourism Organization? These are all places in which U.S. policy is going to butt heads with international law. It's one thing for the U.S. to prevent a vote in the Security Council that provides Israel with political cover. It's quite another for the U.S. to actively argue for Israeli war crimes. And if it proceeds to represent this policy in international bodies in this way, it will become not just turning a blind eye towards Israel's illegality, but actually become a party to them. So this will be an interesting thing to see unfold in the coming weeks, months, years. So why did the U.S. do this now? This move was apparently a shock to everyone except the U.S., Israel, and according to some reports, perhaps Saudi Arabia. well, why now? I mean, they did sign the waiver on the Jerusalem embassy move before. They could have signed it again. They're really, what was the urgency of now? So I'm going to go through the timeline. I don't have an answer for this, but the timeline is very interesting and instructive. So in mid-November, we find Jared Kushner traveling to Saudi Arabia and delivering U.S. parameters to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, which are really Netanyahu's terms. We don't know exactly what these terms were, but we've heard reports that it was that the IDF would stay in the West Bank, that most of the settlements would not be removed, there would be no contiguity for Palestinian urban areas inside the West Bank, and that Abu Dis, a village outside of Jerusalem, could be the Palestinian capital. That was one of the reported, one of the reports of what the terms were that were presented to the Saudi Crown Prince by Jared Kushner. So soon after that, the Crown Prince summons the Palestinian president to Riyadh and relays these terms and offers economic development assistance and other enticements too. And the Palestinian president rejects those terms outright. The Crown Prince then delivers the message to the U.S. And then on December 4th, the U.S., in an apparent attempt to force the Palestinians' hands, fails to sign the waiver to keep the PLO office open for another 6 months. So what's happening during this timeline in the U.S.? We've got Mueller investigations coming close to home for Trump after General Flynn implicated Donald Jr. and Jared Kushner. There was a need to rally the evangelical base to bolster Trump and bolster Pence should Pence become the president, which is why you saw Pence standing behind Trump, I think, in the photo op during Trump's statement of recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Pence needs to go to Israel in December 17th through the 19th with something in hand. And this recognition provided him with something really powerful for his base and Trump's base. And what's going on during this timeline as well in Israel? Since October of this year, we've had the right-wing government of Netanyahu clamoring around this Greater Jerusalem bill that is aimed at expanding the municipal borders of Jerusalem to include the large Israeli settlements and to excise from Jerusalem's borders large Palestinian populated areas. That was put on hold reportedly because of U.S. pressure. Then comes December 2nd. There's large demonstrations against Netanyahu's plan to pass a bill called the Recommendations Bill, which would have shielded him from prosecution for corruption. Because of these protests, on December 3rd, Netanyahu announces that he is going to remove from the bill language that would permit him to benefit from the provisions of that bill and provide him with some immunity. And then on December 5th, Israel's largest daily newspaper reports that 5 leaders of Likud were planning on pressuring Netanyahu to resign amid corruption investigations. And then comes December 6th and Trump's proclamation surprise. So I don't know if all of these things made the decision to recognize the Jerusalem as a capital or propelled Trump's decision to do it on December 6th, but what great timing. What great timing for Benjamin Netanyahu to be able to rally people around him in the midst of his corruption investigation. What great timing for Trump amid his own problems with investigations from Mueller. So I think that there was a big incentive for it to happen now, the recognition of Jerusalem. And I think it was clear very early on to the Trump team that who openly says they will only pursue a policy that is completely in line, where there will be no daylight between U.S. and Israel. It was very clear to them early on, given Netanyahu's parameters, which is basically legitimizing the status quo for Palestinians, that there wasn't going to be an ultimate deal. So who better to blame the failure of there being an ultimate deal than to blame the Palestinians? By focusing on Jerusalem and making this announcement now, they could, they know that that's going to blow up the two-state solution, but they can, still have some constructive deniability because they didn't recognize boundaries or borders around the municipality. But of course, the Palestinians are going to react, and they're going to walk away from negotiations, and then they can blame the Palestinians for the failure of there being any ultimate deal. So it really worked for everyone involved. It worked for the Israelis, it worked for the Americans, and Palestinians are left out in the cold. And just a note on reality, yes, it's a reality that Israel operates Jerusalem as its capital, but there's also another reality. I mean, there's the reality that not a single country recognizes Jerusalem as a capital. There's the reality that the ICJ found settlements in East Jerusalem to be illegal and a war crime. There's a reality that there's six UN Security Council resolutions specifically dealing with Jerusalem and finding Israel's actions in Jerusalem as illegal and invalid. So there are many realities we could talk about when it comes to Jerusalem, and unfortunately the US decided to pick one where might makes right. So what is the legal effect? It doesn't change international law. It's a political decision by one rogue country that happens to be the world superpower. East Jerusalem is still occupied territory, giving Israeli actions there no legal validity. And if anything, as Khalil said, and Yousef also said, this move has really strengthened international law in a way because you've had the whole world rallying behind the fact that what the US did was improper and gave support for an illegality. We had, as Yousef said, 14 members of the Security Council come out against this. We've had the Saudi Arabian Prince Faisal al-Turki come out, really strong statement about what Trump did. We've had Jordan say that it's going to review its agreements with Israel to see what effect this is going to have on their relations. We've had Macron, the premier of France, in a press conference standing with Netanyahu on Monday, condemning Trump's move of or a decision to move the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, and it goes on, including the Pope. I mean, when the Pope cites UN resolutions to oppose Trump's action while Trump cites to the Bible, that's something. So I think that was an interesting development. What Israel is betting on is that there's going to be this domino effect, like, we're going to get the U.S. and then all the countries, Micronesia, Nauru, who knows, who might fall. And then the whole world's just going to make it a reality. And, there is a little bit of fear of that because we've seen the Czech Republic recognize West Jerusalem as the capital, and we've seen the Philippines say they're going to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. So, that's a possibility, but I don't think so. I don't think so to the degree that Israel is betting on. There's too much law on this subject for that to happen. And now, what can Palestinians do and those who support international legality? There's talk of pushing the U.S. to retract or clarify or qualify its recognition. There's talk by the Arab League to take the question to the UN Security Council. I mean, I don't really know what you're going to have happen in the UN Security Council when there's a U.S. with a veto power there, but that's one avenue Palestinians have talked about pursuing. There's a pivot to Europe, Russia, China, now that the U.S. has washed its hands of being a peace broker. And I think those countries like France are really ready to do that. There's a campaign to have European countries recognize Palestine with East Jerusalem as its capital based on the 1967 borders. And I think that people need to be very careful about that, because I think that the impulse is going to be that if the Europeans recognize East Jerusalem as Palestine's capital, they're going to want to say, we also recognize West Jerusalem, and that would give Israel something real while giving Palestinians only a symbol, since they don't have control over the territory. So if that was pursued, it should be pursued as recognition of Palestinian rights to East Jerusalem as their capital, and prospective recognition of West Jerusalem as Israel's capital only if it came with a peace agreement with the Palestinians. There's also talk of a UN General Assembly, the UN General Assembly requesting an advisory opinion from the ICJ on the status of Jerusalem following U.S. political recognition and what the implications are for third-party states and what their responsibilities are. There could also be a convocation of the high contracting parties of the Fourth Geneva Convention to talk about what third-party states' responsibilities are following the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. So there are various other activities that the Palestinians and others could pursue, but I only had 3 minutes ago, so I'm going to stop there and allow Perry to continue.
Thank you, Zaha, very much. Okay, and now we'll focus on the impact of this decision on options in the Middle East. Are we still stuck with the two-state, or are we inching toward the one-state solution, and what are the implications? Perry?
Easy questions. Thanks, Khalil and Arab Center, for this opportunity. It's a pleasure to be with Yousef and Zaha here today. So I thought I would look kind of first quickly at what I see as the short-term implications, in part because I think I see things slightly different than my esteemed colleagues here, and then, as Khalil mentioned, kind of shift towards what I see as the longer-term implications. First, I mean, Jerusalem, as everyone has said, has always been kind of an important bargaining chip for the United States government. So I was struck when I was watching the announcement last week that for a president whose own staff has called him, quote, the best negotiator in the history of this world, to kind of give up that chip without getting anything in response, my first reaction was just, this is diplomatic and negotiations malpractice and kind of befuddling. As I thought about it a little more, I at least convinced myself, that perhaps the implications aren't quite as dire and as catastrophic as some might think. So in other words, yes, it's a bad decision, but I'm not sure it's a calamitous one. So why do I say that? First, I think in many ways, and others have kind of already touched on this a little bit, this was really a symbolic event, which at least for the short term, I think has little practical impact in terms of U.S. policy on the ground. I mean, it's interesting that even as the president was making the announcement, he still signed the 6-month waiver for the Jerusalem Embassy Act. It's clear that the actual relocation of the embassy is going to take many years. Frankly, it may not happen even beyond that. I also think it is important that Trump explicitly stated that this did not prejudge final status issues, with all the caveats that my colleagues mentioned here. I think this is an important clarification, because if we imagine a subsequent administration kind of trying to figure out what the implications of this announcement are for their own policy, I think it gives a future administration the latitude to interpret this strictly as a recognition of undisputed portions of West Jerusalem with no bearing on East Jerusalem. And I understand there's lots of complications with that. But as I was kind of watching the statement, I was reminded of the president's announcement, quote unquote, to pull out, or not to pull out, but not to certify the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran negotiations. In other words, we kind of saw the same dynamic where the president makes a very bold statement, makes a big splash, but then if you actually look at what it means in practical terms, there's actually not much there. So in terms of the Iran deal, the U.S. is now in this kind of strange purgatory where it's kind of seems to be halfway out, but yet it's remained halfway in. And in some ways, I think we're seeing the same thing with the Jerusalem announcement, that there's an intention there. We're in a purgatory, but the embassy is in Tel Aviv and is likely to remain there for several years. The other reason why, second reason, in terms of why I'm somewhat hopeful that this will not have quite the negative consequences that some fear, is I think some of the worst case scenarios in terms of the immediate reaction or the resort to violence, I think, have been avoided. It's clear, I think Khalil made reference to this, ISIS and Al-Qaeda recruiters are going to try to use this in their propaganda, but I'm not sure that this statement fundamentally changes that situation. Now, some of you may detect a contradiction in my remarks here. I said that this was negotiating malpractice on one hand, and now I'm saying that the implications may be a bit more modest than we expect. So how do I reconcile these two statements? Well, and this is really the core point, if this announcement had been made in 2000 or in 2005 or in 2010, I think then it really would be a game changer of announcement. But from my perspective, the reality is there's not a peace process now. There hasn't been a real peace process for 10 years. The Trump administration, the Trump initiative wasn't going anywhere anyway. So in terms of the actual impact on the negotiations, in the absence of negotiations, I actually find things to be pretty limited. So at least in the short term, my own assessment of the implications, and I think all of the others have alluded to this, really is the increased diplomatic isolation of Washington, and I say this with sadness, with Washington, both regard to our NATO allies, regional partners, as well as in international organizations. This isn't a new trend. It didn't start with the Trump administration. I mean, I think we can mark kind of the invasion of Iraq in 2003 as the beginning of a structural change and a decline of U.S. influence in the region and more broadly. But clearly, this is expediting that trend that's already there. So I certainly don't want to be seen as trying to trivialize what happened, but rather, I guess I would say this is something like a nail in a coffin of a peace process that has been buried, rather than the coffin itself. So I personally agree. I think every one of us has said kind of the Oslo era is over. I mark maybe last week's statement really maybe not a tipping point, but an inflection point, in the sense of, again, I think the Oslo period has been over perhaps for a decade or more, but I think this could be an inflection point insofar as there is now wider recognition of that, both in the United States and the region and beyond. So I thought it might be interesting to kind of think through quickly what that actually means. If we are in a post-Oslo period, what does that mean for the conflict? I think for Israel, it pretty clearly means a continuation of the status quo. It means continued settlement activity, possibly with less resistance from Washington, although I do think the backlash against the Trump administration has been quite interesting, and I think it's at least conceivable that could lead to some change in the U.S. posture with regard to Israeli settlement activity. I expect a lot of the trends that we've seen in Israel to continue. It will continue to try to expand relations with its Sunni partners vis-a-vis Iran, possibly deteriorating relations with Europe. I think Israel will likely enjoy continued warm relations with Israel. That's clear. Prime Minister Netanyahu, I think, is in real political jeopardy in Israel, but I'm not sure that a new Israeli government, frankly, would have policies that are significantly different than what they currently are. In terms of how Europe might approach a kind of post-Oslo environment, I think there are clearly some in Europe who see an opportunity to take advantage of Washington's fall from grace as the kind of preferred mediator. I expect there may be talks and moves towards contemplating a kind of tougher posture with respect to the Israeli settlements. But I think it remains a case that Europe lacks fundamental internal consensus on the issue. and also lacks leverage with the parties. And so the idea that Europe can really replace the U.S. as a mediator, I think doesn't add up. In terms of the Arab states, as already been mentioned, I think we're going to see a lot of diplomatic activity in the next couple of weeks. I am quite certain that Vice President Pence is going to get a pretty frosty reception during several stops in his tour. But again, once that energy dissipates, I'm not sure fundamentally that the situation will have changed that much. I think many Arab states are very reluctant. This is a very turbulent time for the Middle East, which will surprise no one in this room. And I think many Arab states are turbulent to rock that boat. Many of those same states, while they're deeply alarmed and concerned and angered by the U.S. decision, I think, frankly, are more worried about Iran than Palestine. And so I think the fundamental logic of some degree of security cooperation between Israel and many of the Arab states still holds. That cooperation will probably be tempered. I think it will be reassessed, but fundamentally, I'm not sure the posture of the Arab states dramatically changes as a result of this. For the United States, too, I mean, as I've mentioned, I think perhaps less has changed here than meets the eye. Again, because I'm not sure there's been a real peace process for quite some time, unfortunately. I personally agree that President Trump probably has very little day-to-day interest in this issue. I think once it's clear that there really is not a pathway to a negotiated outcome, I think it's likely that the administration will begin to lose its interest. So then the question is, if you had a new administration with a different perspective on the issues in 3 years, what would that mean? Perhaps the embassy moves, perhaps it doesn't. Perhaps that administration invests energy into the process, perhaps it doesn't. But I think if we take a step back and look at things kind of from a structural level, and I'll say this as someone who considers myself an admirer of Israel, I'm convinced that the United States is not interested in exercising the degree of political muscle necessary to force Israel to make the concessions necessary to allow for a two-state solution. So in other words, you know, there may be lip service that's played to this, but the reality is something different. So I've talked about all the parties except for one, which of course is the Palestinians. And I actually think this is the most interesting case because even though I think it's objectively the case that the Palestinians are the weakest party in this, I actually think it's the choices that the Palestinian national movement makes over not the next weeks or months or possibly even years, but over a longer time horizon that will go a long way to defining the contours of the way the conflict looks. Now, at Carnegie, we put out a report called Revitalizing Palestinian Nationalism, which I encourage everyone to read. But I do think it has some relevance to the discussion that we're having now. Basically, what we, a couple colleagues and myself did, was to survey approximately 6 dozen Palestinian thought leaders from all walks of life, politics, civil society, youth movements, academics, former government officials, et cetera. And there's a lot of experts here, perhaps even some people that participated in our survey, so I don't want to speak on behalf of Palestinian movement, but I do think there are some findings we have which are relevant to the situation we're in. I think it won't surprise people here to hear that this group collectively of 60 people or so basically found in aggregate that the Palestinian national movement was in a state of crisis, both in terms of the kind of instruments of that national movement, the PLO, Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, but also in the sense of lacking a kind of clear national strategy in the light of the kind of collapse of a negotiated two-state outcome. So the question we were asking to this group of prominent Palestinians was, where does the Palestinian national movement go from here? And I won't try to kind of predict the future, but I do think we can see some strains of possibility. Violence, I think, of course, is a real possibility, whether it's driven kind of from the top down in terms of Hamas and the leadership or from the bottom up in terms of kind of a popular reaction to what can seem like a pretty hopeless situation. The Palestinians we talked to, with a few exceptions, I think saw that as a disastrous outcome in terms of their own aspirations, but given the situation, I don't think it can be discounted. Another possibility, and again, this is based on what we heard, is that this kind of shift towards rights-based approaches begins to gain traction, especially if it's seen that the goal of a Palestinian state no longer seems viable. So, I mean, this can take a lot of different forms, as we examine in the report, from BDS, the boycott, divest, sanctions, to civil resistance, and in some cases even the idea of a kind of binational or one-state outcome. One of the interesting things I heard in some of the discussions we had here is this refrain, especially from kind of activists, from youth leaders, that, and perhaps it represents a little bit of a shift in the sense of it's not necessarily the state itself that's important, but what that state conveys and the rights that are embedded in that state, which to me is interesting because if that notion begins to take hold, I think it could suggest that the fidelity to a two-state outcome, if again that two-state outcome is seen as an impossibility, could be possibly weaker than some have proposed. Now, polling on binationalism suggests very low support among Palestinians. I mean, it can be as low as 18%, depending on what poll you look at. But one of the young Palestinians we talked to said something to me which I thought kind of resonated, which is that there may actually be a kind of latent support for a kind of one-state approach if there's a catalyzing event that causes people to rally around it. And this event, I think it's interesting that Abu Mazen himself made some reference to a kind of one-state outcome in his UNGA speech last summer. In Saeb Erekat, his immediate reaction to the Jerusalem announcement contained reference to a kind of one-state outcome. We'll see. I have no prediction or personal view on this, but I think it's a very important indicator. Where does the kind of center of gravity within the Palestinian national movement go if we really are in a post-Oslo environment? And maybe I'll end on the last point, which is the demographics. If this is really an inflection point on the Oslo era, it comes at an interesting point because 2017, by a lot of demographic projections that I've seen, marks actually a moment of precise demographic parity in which there are basically 6.4 million people on both sides. Obviously, given differential birth rates, there is almost certainly to be a Palestinian demographic majority for Palestinians in the decades to come, and I think that in itself will have a profound effect on the contours of the conflict in ways that are difficult to predict. Now, I think Israel will never agree to a one-state outcome, particularly a one-state outcome in which there's a Jewish minority, which takes me in some ways back to where we begin, where in that context, I think actually it perhaps is too early to write off a two-state solution, but perhaps it will come about in a way that's far uglier, far more painful, far more time-consuming than the architects of the Oslo Accords envisioned back in 1993. So I think if we look at the conflict perhaps from this broader perspective, I'm not, the Jerusalem decision is perhaps not so important as it might seem, in part because I think it reflects the reality of an Oslo process that has been collapsing for many, many years. Thank you.
Thank you, Perry. All right, now we will spend the balance of our time answering your questions. Again, just a reminder, there are cards on your seats. If you have a question or a comment, make it short, direct, address it to a panelist if you would prefer to do so. Indicate your name and affiliation just for affiliation purposes, and we'll be more than glad to read your questions. Let's start with Stanley Kober Will the focus now shift to the growing confrontation with Iran, especially giving Nasrallah's speech? Anybody would like to tackle this one?
Yeah, I'm not sure that's the case. In fact, I think one of the points that we didn't get a chance to cover is the impact that this decision has on this idea of trying to bring the Arab states together in some sort of alliance against Iran. And I thought it was funny actually when if you'd followed the comments by Jared Kushner a few days before this declaration at the Brookings Institution, he said, "Well, we brought 54 Arab states together for the first time in May, you know." And talked about, you know, the threat of Iran and all of that. Never mind that, you know, the Organization of Islamic Conference has existed since 1969. But this idea that sort of the Arabs were going to come together with Israel to ally with Iran, if that's really what you wanted to do, then this decision is like the exact opposite of what you would want. Because what this does now is it feeds the narratives of resistance in the region, which is precisely what it is that the Iranians and their allies in the region are trafficking. And so I think this makes, I've always thought the idea of sort of an outside-in approach to Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking was nonsense. This makes it even more clear that is the case. You saw that the Arab states had to run to come out and condemn this for a reason, because nobody wants to be seen as cooperating with the United States to throw the Palestinians under the bus. And if you look at public opinion polling that is fresh out today from Khalil Shikaki in the West Bank of Palestinian public opinion in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, very significant numbers of Palestinians distrust the Saudi role in the region. They distrust the Jordanian role in the region. They distrust the Emirati role in the region. And these are all American allies. So Palestine continues to be the prism through which publics in the region view the relationship with the West and with the United States. So I think this actually has a very negative impact on trying to create that scheme that was previously discussed.
Okay, the next question is from Catherine Hughes Freitich, regarding the two-state solution and the one-state option. I know, Perry, you discussed this, but would you care to comment on, should that be the case, the trend, if you will, for the future? What are the initial steps specifically that lead toward that? How do you see that, if that's the scenario of the future? How do you see it progressing?
First, I don't want to take any personal, just presenting our work kind of analytically. I take no personal opinion on one way or the other. I mean, I think part of the challenge is to a one-state option. Well, many challenges. One is that the pathway to success is at least as difficult as it has been for a two-state solution. And when we were in discussions, some of them very passionate and heated with Palestinians on this. A number of Palestinians, I would say, particularly of an older generation, although not exclusively so, would say, be very careful. We've spent generations building up these institutions, and the risk of kind of losing these institutions in kind of making a paradigm shift, or at least damaging them is significant. So I don't have a good answer to the question in terms of how it happened, but I do think things like it doesn't have to be. I think what's interesting about these kinds of rights-based approaches is that to some extent they're agnostic about final outcomes. So they can exist in Israel, in UN law. I mean, the BDS example, which we look at a little bit, is an example of a rights-based approach, which at least ostensibly is agnostic to a final state outcome. So, I think that was part of the challenge that we found, is that there is not consensus at this moment, at least that we discerned, in terms of the pathway forward in a post-Oslo environment.
Can I just add to that, though?
Sure.
I think one thing that there is consensus on, regardless to what is the long-term objective of one state or two, or rights-based or lands for peace or whatever else, is that the current model does not in any way put the kind of pressure necessary on Israel to get it to concede to either one state or two, right? And I think there is consensus that that has to change, right? That cannot continue.
All right, Dan Lieberman asks in terms of the status of the old city. I'll direct that to you, Zaha. Do you believe this step might be taken advantage of by Israel to complete extending its jurisdiction over the old city?
I mean, it already has jurisdiction over the old city. I think what
And the Haram al-Sharif.
And okay. Well, I think the status quo is going to be maintained. I mean, that's what Trump made clear in his statement. But what I think we'll see is more attempts to chip at that over time. We saw that with the installation or the attempted installation of security, equipment in the entrances to the Haram al-Sharif and the video cameras, and the strong reaction by Palestinians to that. I think there'll be more attempts like that in the future. And now with the recognition coming from the U.S., Jordan will have to come out even stronger when those incidents happen as the custodian of the holy place is there. So that will be something interesting to see. As I said in my remarks about the Greater Jerusalem bill, that's going to move forward. So in Jerusalem at large, we're going to see a very active work on Israel's part to expand the borders, to change the demographics of what is Jerusalem in its newly defined way. So those are all things that will be coming, and I think the reaction from Jordan will be interesting to see how they deal with the Haram al-Sharif in particular.
Okay, the next question is from Jafari. The proposed U.S. embassy location is legally a confiscated Palestinian property. Does this worry the U.S., and what are the legal ramifications if that's the case? That's addressed to you, Perry.
My understanding is there is no proposed, there's not an actual site, and I suspect that that's actually by design. In terms of the legal implications, I defer to Zaha.
I think there was a location that was previously identified as being the site for the embassy, and that I think that's what you're talking about, Jaffa. That it's a Waqf property as well as the property of Palestinian refugees, some of whom are U.S. citizens. And this will be an interesting question because there was a letter of protest written by an attorney for the Palestinian U.S. citizens about the U.S. purchasing that property. This is another avenue for challenging, if it comes to pass that becomes the location for the embassy, then the U.S. citizens will have an opportunity to present their case in a U.S. court about the legal validity of the U.S. Taking over property that belongs to U.S. citizens. So that will be an interesting thing. I imagine there'll be issues of political question involved in that litigation that might prevent it from moving very far. But the PR opportunity for Palestinians and sort of being able to expose the fact that the U.S. is directly complicit in human rights violations and land confiscation of its own citizens abroad would be a very difficult thing for the U.S. to explain. But they've, it's not to say that it wouldn't move forward because of that.
Yeah, if I might add, during a previous attempt to move the embassy, the U.S. did look at one specific property that was recommended by the Israelis in Talbiya. And that piece of property ended up, after investigation, at the time I was a member of the American Committee on Jerusalem, and we did look into that property and located the actual owners, and they included several actually Palestinian Americans, U.S. citizens who had actually deed to the property in West Jerusalem. We did raise the issue at the time on multiple occasions and some serious negotiations through kind of legal means with the State Department. They were very concerned about it at the time. They did look into it, and eventually that piece of real estate fizzled as a potential site. Not because of our activities necessarily, maybe we did influence the process, but it fizzled because that when it became public that might be the site of a new embassy, some real estate developers on the Jewish side in West Jerusalem wanted to cash in on the thing and basically started building high-rise apartment buildings to rent to the U.S., which of course violates the security considerations of the United States. Embassies should not be right next door to high-rise buildings for security reasons. So that kind of fizzled at the time. But the issue that was of interest to me personally at the time was, can we convince the U.S. government to apply, for example, the same law that we used, our lawyer at the time used it with the arguments with the State Department, that there is a law pertaining, for example, to American citizens' property in Cuba being confiscated. Can we use that precedent to defend the right of Palestinian Americans to defend their property from not being used for building a U.S. embassy? So the probing, if you will, the legal system, at the time, we sensed that there was a refusal to apply the precedent from Cuba to Palestine in this regard. Anyway, the next, go ahead, you have a follow-up?
Yes, please.
Go ahead.
Actually, my question does not concern the property being owned by Palestinian Americans.
Mm-hmm.
The property itself is Palestinian, regardless where they reside. Dr. Walid Khaldi wrote a manuscript.
That was the effort, yeah, exactly. The manuscript was summary of the effort that we did together, yes.
So the question is not really whether the U.S. is would be confiscating its citizens' properties. That's not the case.
Mm-hmm.
Legally or politically, it is a confiscated Palestinian territory,
Mm-hmm.
regardless where the embassy location will be built, if ever.
Yeah, I think you're right. That wasn't the focus, but it definitely was an approach, if you will, a technique, a legal kind of method to kind of get to the, because frankly, as Zaha just mentioned, U.S. courts prefer not to kind of be dragged into things outside their jurisdictions. And in the past, they have turned down all these cases. I mean, there are probably dozens of cases involving similar situations, whether in Jerusalem or not. But the fact of the matter, correct me if I'm not wrong, short of a peace negotiated process between Israel and the Palestinians, West Jerusalem has a high percentage of Palestinian-owned land that is supposed to be discussed and negotiated. That keeps getting ignored in this whole process of from the peace processes in the 60s to the 70s to the 80s to the 90s. When we talk about Jerusalem, we're not talking about Palestinian-owned land just in East Jerusalem. At one point, of course, because the border is very elastic and Israelis keep changing the borders of West Jerusalem, at one point, West Jerusalem, quote unquote, used to be about 60 to 70% Palestinian-owned land, public or private. And at one point, should there be a genuine, serious peace process, that has to be put on the table, is my point. The next question is from Megan, Middle East Policy Council. It's been said that the likelihood of U.S. Embassy actually moving is very low. Why is this? Is it just a security issue or other issues?
Well, one, I think even in the kind of best, in an easy scenario, I mean, within, say, the last 10 years or so, embassies, I believe, in London and certainly in Berlin, there was a move of embassy. And given this, the challenge of finding property, the internal review, the security requirements, legal review, et cetera, budget challenges, congressional oversight. This takes time in the easiest of circumstances, which this clearly would not be. This is a process that would likely take years. When you have an administration that itself doesn't seem particularly keen to expedite the process, it's very easy for me to imagine this being a process that took 5 or 7 years.
Can I just add to that, the current U.S. Consul is located in the no man's land, which I could envision if the U.S. really wanted to push this and to not exacerbate an already very inflammatory situation, would be to locate the U.S. Embassy where the consulate is now in that no man's land, because it wouldn't really be east, it wouldn't really be west, and they could, sort of have their embassy and not have so much of the flack behind it. I don't know that will happen, but that has been something that's been kind of floated about. And just a footnote on the Cuba situation, if you look at the statute that deals with confiscation of Cuban property, there's an exception that has a time frame that neatly fits in with the time when Israel was confiscating Palestinian refugee property. So that's like, it provides for a cause of action for Cubans, but it would exclude Palestinians from ever utilizing that statute. So really crafty thoughts, and whoever drafted that legislation.
Let me conclude with a question from John Anderson. I'll address it to you, Yousef. If things move in the direction of a one-state solution, would the focus, or how would the focus be on things like equal rights, the right of return, and some of these other issues? Would that change the term of reference in how we deal with these issues?
Well, I think in that framework, you still have to have conversations about the practical implementation of all of these issues. The options for how they get implemented obviously change. The trade-off in that framework is not land for peace, but rights for peace, which means that you're no longer talking about finding ways to divide up demography, but to create space within the political system for power sharing. So I think all of those things can be addressed in that frame, but how you go about them is very much different than the way you would go about them in a two-state frame.
Okay, I would like to leave you with a quote. About several hundred articles have been written over the past 6 days over this issue. And yesterday there was a Politico had a column by David, dealing with this issue. Aaron David Miller summarized it with his usual eloquence, and based on his experience of many years dealing with the peace process in the Middle East, he said, "The president move was an epic blunder that made peace far harder to achieve. Trump's Jerusalem gambit isn't a world ender. It's just ill-timed, ill-conceived, ill-considered, and unmoored from any real strategy that would advance U.S. national interest, peace, or security. Other than that, it's great." And may I just indulge you with one more. I don't like to do that very often, but we have a special guest with us today, Dr. Hanna Suwaid, visiting from Palestine, Israel, and he served between 2006 and 2015, represented the Palestinian citizens of Israel in the Knesset, and did a superb job doing so with dignity under very difficult circumstances. Hanna, would you stand, just let people. And having dealt with this issue in the Knesset, I appreciate your patience sitting still and not standing up to add to that. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here today. We'll see you in a future event. Thank you.